Hi class. Today we are going to talk about Robert Russell, his article called Non-Interventionist Objective Divine Action. NIODA. Look, he's a philosopher of science. This makes him especially predisposed to long, clunky titles. These words, when we break them down, I think are easy to grasp, and I think some of the nuance of the article might be lost on you, but I think the overarching point you will be able to grasp. If you haven't already, I think this lecture will help. Here's where we're at in the class. We are thinking in particular about how God acts in the world. This divine action is like a giant topic in theology. How does God act in the world? Is God controlling all events? Is the world predominantly free and God only intervenes sometimes? Is God completely hands-off and only interacts with us spiritually, right? Spirit to spirit, but God's not controlling the events in the physical world. Like, how do we understand God's action and how God acts? That's sort of the big theological question that we're wrestling with right now. I assume many of you have asked this question, like, what's God up to? What does God actually do in the world? How does it get done? Is it possible to even detect divine action as opposed to like natural law or something, right? So these are the kinds of questions that we're going to be engaging. The science that we're going to be looking at in particular is quantum mechanics, sort of the lowest level. But I want to remind you that everything in the physical universe is made up of quantum particles. You, me, the floor, your house, the computer you're looking at right now. Subatomic particles, the same basic elements, constitute all of physical reality, right? So understanding how those interactions take place at lower levels can help us understand macro events in the world. Okay, so to help with the article, right, to help you get a better sense of what Robert Russell was arguing, I want to look at some of the terminology, right, like get some of the terms down. I think that will help. So let me change the slide here. So something that is often referenced in the literature is God's general activity. Historically, within Christianity, that meant natural laws. So God creates a set of natural laws, and those natural laws govern the physical universe. They govern a lot even of like chemical and electrical activity. That would include neurological activity. These natural laws were considered general providence, the way God keeps everything in motion, right? God as sustainer of the world. So God's general activity was through natural law, cause and effect, very predictable, and from an Einstein or Newtonian perspective, sort of deterministic, these natural laws, right? So then a miracle, the second term here, a miracle would be God thwarts natural laws and does something specific, right? So a miracle is an intervention, right? Intervening in the laws of nature, breaking them or violating them to do something specific. So again, a dead person, Jesus, comes back to life on Easter Sunday. The dead coming back to life is a miracle. It doesn't follow natural law. It's not part of God's general providence. It's a specific act that requires God to intervene with the laws of nature, thwart or overcome the laws of nature to make something happen. Some of you have experienced healing, or someone you loved has experienced like divine healing. We often think of those as miracles. If nature took its course, this person should die of some illness, cancer, some disease. God breaks in, thwarts the laws of nature, and we call that something like a miracle, right? God's special activity, these can be miraculous, okay? General activity is very predictable. Science can measure natural law and understand God's general providence, right? Miracles are anomalies. They are rare, thwarting the laws of nature. God's special activity could be a miracle, but often God's special activity might be something like God opens the heart of an employer, helps them see the applicant clearly, and the employer gives that person the job because that was something that God wanted to happen. God needed this person in a particular role. So God, it's not quite like a miracle, like you had cancer and now you don't, but it is sort of like special activity in that God is doing something unique in this particular situation. But not all of God's special activity would we call miraculous, at least the way we typically define miracle. It might be like I think about my own life, God opening doors for me, or maybe closing other doors, where I feel like God was active in a particular situation, but I wouldn't have any sort of notion that that was a miracle. So it doesn't quite meet that standard, but it's still God doing something specific, not just the general providence of natural law. Okay? So we have sort of ways of thinking about God's action. And I'll review briefly. I drop my pen, it falls to the floor. That's natural law. We think of that as God's general activity, how God created the universe. I drop my pen, it falls, and then it stops halfway down because God directly intervened with the laws of nature and caused the miracle to happen, right? A special activity would be God wanting something to happen in the world. It might require a miracle, but it might just require God speaking to someone's heart, right? Changing circumstances in a different, more moderate way. Okay, objective divine action. So I want to go back. Remember, the title is non-interventionist objective divine action, right? So what does objective divine action mean? Objective divine action means God did something to the world, changed something that actually happened in the physical universe, right? Objectively, God changed something. When you think of objective, think of dealing with the object. The physical universe was changed by God. Subjective divine action is something that we might experience, but it's dealing with the subject. It's internal, it's personal to me, the subject, not in the external world or the object, right? So objective divine action is God caused a lightning bolt to strike a particular tree to create a forest fire. That would be objective divine action. God caused something to happen in the physical world. Subjective divine action is, last night I was praying and I felt a strong sense that God was calling me to call my friend Terry, right? Maybe he's feeling particularly depressed and isolated because of COVID. And so God moved in my heart. But do you see how that's subjective? That's subject to subject, me and God. It's personal. Nothing happened in the physical universe. It was a subjective encounter with God that caused me to want to do something in particular, right? Objective divine action would mean, God caused something to hit me in the head, and because that hit me in the head, then I thought to myself, oh, call Terry, right? That object hitting me, God doing something in the physical universe, would be objective divine action. But most of our encounters with God are subjective. Most of the time we have a heart change. Maybe it's someone going from a non-believer to becoming a Christian. God's worked in their heart. It's very personal. It's very subjective, right? Often that's how we encounter God, is with subjective divine action. But Robert Russell wants to ask, what's God doing in the world? Not just how is God acting in my life or in my heart, in my mind, but what is God doing in the world? What events is God causing? So Robert Russell wants a theory of objective divine action, not just subjective divine action. Some other terminology from the article. Epistemic ignorance versus ontologically indeterminate. Now, I mentioned this already with quantum mechanics in the previous lecture. If you have not watched that, I encourage you to watch it, right? If you haven't done the previous reading, I encourage you to do that. At the quantum level, we have probability wave functions that we use, complicated mathematics to figure out where a particular particle, like a proton or an electron, is. But we cannot know the particle's momentum and location with exact accuracy. It's not determinate, it's indeterminate, it's probabilistic. Early on, quantum physicists believed that it was just a lack of our knowledge. The more we studied these particles, the more we developed a better mathematical framework for quantum mechanics, we would know with exact precision the momentum and the location of a particle. But that did not happen, and in fact now the common view, like the uncontroversial common view amongst experts in quantum mechanics, is the universe is fundamentally, ontologically indeterminate. It is impossible to know. It's not just that we don't know right now. It is impossible to know with precision, with certainty, with any kind of precise accuracy, the momentum and location of a particle. Probability governs the lowest level of reality, not determinism, right? Probability, indeterminacy. So there's an ontological or fundamental indeterminacy with the world. This is going to be very important for Robert Russell's argument, okay? Because Robert Russell wants to argue God intentionally creates the universe so that all of these micro events are indeterminate, meaning the laws of physics, the laws of nature are not a sufficient, efficient cause for any event in the world. The laws of nature are not enough to determine quantum events. They are open-ended, ontologically, fundamentally indeterminate, right? So the universe itself has micro events. Billions of them are happening in this room all around me, right? So many are happening in the universe, these quantum events, all fundamentally indeterminate. None of them have an efficient cause from nature. Nature gives them a set of influences, but no definitive cause. That's why we can't know definitively the momentum and location of a particle. Nature does not give an adequate set of causes to predict the momentum and location of a particle. They're indeterminate. Nature doesn't allow for that. And here's Robert Russell's point. God creates the natural world so that it requires natural processes and it requires God's direct activity at the quantum level. God's activity plus the laws of nature help determine where those particles end up. And because God's activity influences every single micro event at the quantum level, God is actually able to control the macro world. Okay? Nature is open, it's probabilistic. God is able to intervene at the quantum level. God plus nature pushes those particles where they're to go, and that eventually leads to macro events. I hope that makes sense to you. That's his overarching argument. So what's God doing in the world? God is active at the quantum level. God plus nature is a sufficient cause for where the particles end up, and all those quantum events end up leading to macro events in the world. So God's activity is throughout the quantum world, throughout the universe, at every moment. Okay? And God created the universe such that the physical universe requires God's activity at the quantum level. Right? Requires it. So the next set of terms, interventionist divine action, non-interventionist divine action. Interventionist divine action means God must intervene and break the laws of nature to act in the world, right? So God would have to heal someone from cancer, bring someone back from the dead. These are interventionist views of God's action, okay? God has to violate the laws of nature and intervene in the natural world to have objective divine action occur, okay? So that's one way of thinking about it. And Robert Russell says, why would God create the universe so that God has to violate the laws that God created to get anything done in the world? Why would God create a system that requires objective divine intervention that violates or thwarts those laws? Rather, Robert Russell says, a much more elegant worldview, a much more elegant creation, and one that fits the best science, that creates integration between faith and science, is one where God creates the universe and the laws of nature such that at the lowest levels, it's open-ended and indeterminate, right? This is how nature is. This is the natural world we live in. God can work into that openness at the quantum level, and God's activity combined with natural law can cause micro events to happen, which eventually create macro events. But it does not require an interventionist model of divine action. It's a non-interventionist model because Robert Russell means non-interventionist. What he means by that is God doesn't have to violate the laws of nature. Non-interventionist means God works with the laws of nature to get things done in the world. God does not have to violate the laws of nature. God works with the laws of nature. That's what makes it non-interventionist. So, we go back to the title, Robert Russell. A non-interventionist objective divine action. God has created the universe fundamentally indeterminate. The laws of nature are not a sufficient cause for the quantum events we see. The laws of nature plus divine activity are, but God doesn't have to violate the laws of nature. God works with the laws of nature, so it's non-interventionist. God is changing events in the world. By working at micro levels, God is able to change macro events in the physical world. So this is objective divine action. It's not just subjective in my heart. It's not just God talking to me and me feeling called to do something because God's changed my heart. That would be subjectivist divine action. But this is objective divine action where God is actually influencing the quantum level and changing the physical world that we live in, right? So it's a non-interventionist, objective divine action. So that's Robert Russell's view. Now, Robert Russell would also argue God subjectively acts in the world. God does call individuals change hearts and minds. God is doing that. God is doing that right now. In addition to subjective divine action, though, Robert Russell believes there is objective divine action. God is getting things done in the physical world, working and operating at the quantum level. So I hope this is helping you make sense of the article. I'm going to read his thesis, right, for NIODA, and then I'm going to try to summarize what I've said so that his overarching argument makes sense to you. I assume there will be questions. Let's do it. You can email me directly. You can put questions on the discussion board. I think this is a great time to start give and take, try to clarify. Let me know where you're at, right? So if you have the handout, I'm going to read. Let's see here if I can find it. Yes, 586. So I will read 586 here. Here I will adopt the view first championed by Werner Heisenberg as a form of the Copenhagen interpretation, namely, that quantum mechanics depicts nature as fundamentally or ontologically indeterminate. By ontologically indeterministic, I mean again that nature provides the necessary but not the sufficient causes for quantum events to occur. While the Schrödinger equation applies deterministically to the propagation of the wave function and includes efficient causes in the form of potential energies during a quantum event or collapse of the wave function, the Schrödinger equation does not apply, and there is no efficient natural cause that brings about this event. The natural causes are necessary but not sufficient at the quantum level. It's indeterminate. It is this interpretation which forms the promising basis for what I call NIODA. Here's the key here. My central thesis is that God acts objectively and directly in and through quantum events to actualize one of several potential outcomes. In short, the collapse of the wave function occurs because of divine and natural activity working together, even while God's action remains ontologically different from natural agency. Okay. God is a supernatural being. Think of like God as the God of the Bible. Nature is a set of natural processes, natural laws that God created, right? Nature itself is a necessary set of causes for quantum events, but not sufficient. It requires both the natural world and God's objective, non-interventionist action to have certain quantum events occur. That will change macro events, and so God doesn't have to violate the laws of nature. God can work with nature and the natural world at the quantum level. Science can't detect God's activity at the quantum level. What we see as probability, as indeterministic, is we can see what nature's doing, but we can't see what God's doing. So science, the measurables make the quantum world look indeterminate because science can't detect God's activity, right? So what looks indeterminate and probabilistic is true from a purely natural or scientific perspective. But once you add God's activity to the quantum, then you end up with events that God is determining, essentially, at the quantum level, right? So, something to ask. Is God controlling all quantum events? If God is controlling all quantum events, then we live in a deterministic universe, totally controlled by God. If God controls every quantum event, then that means God's controlling every macro event, because macro events are just the result of quantum activity. So if God controls every single quantum event, God is in control of every macro event. God's in control of everything that happens in my brain. Quantum events are how I end up with memory, my electrical activity, my chemical activity. God's controlling my thoughts, my desires, my actions. Same with you and everyone else. One theological view would say, yes, God's in total control. God's in control, and Robert Russell's model would allow for that. Okay? But a second option is, what if God doesn't control all quantum events? What if God created nature to be free, an element of randomness and probability at the quantum level, that even God allows for novelty and surprise to emerge from this chaos in some ways, right? So there's real freedom in the world, but sometimes God enters the quantum, works with nature, so it would still be a non-interventionist objective divine action. God works with some quantum events to bring about some macro events, but only sometimes. In other words, God wants certain things to happen, and God will ensure that they happen working with nature, not thwarting nature, but working with nature, but that God doesn't do it all of the time. God only does it some of the time. This would allow for God to work with nature. It would allow God to do certain things in the natural world, but it might also allow for real autonomy and freedom. So I'm curious about which of those you might prefer. Which do you think Robert Russell is advocating? This is complex stuff. I hope you're able to track and enjoying the conversation. Let me know what questions you have.